Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever seen a loved one before they passed away and heard their final words or words in the preceding weeks and wondered what it really means, then do we have the Words at the Threshold show for you. Today I'll be talking with Lisa Smartt, linguist, educator, poet, and the founder of the Final Words Project and the author of an amazing new book, Words at the Threshold. And that's just what I want to talk with her about today, about what we say as we're nearing death and why it matters so. That plus we'll talk about last requests and chocolate shavings, beautiful white butterflies coming out of your mouth, Jack the Magician and Roger Ebert, why there is so much so in sorrow, and what in the world corned beef on rye with slaw on the side has to do with anything. Gotcha. So welcome to the show, Lisa. Are you ready to shine?
I am ready to shine. Thank
Woohoo!
you.
And for everyone listening, if you hear the occasional ping, it almost feels like we're being visited in Morse code here. We've been trying with multiple microphones to figure it out. It's something very interesting in the show today. So on the interesting side of things, why don't we dive right into things? What were Steve Jobs' last words?
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's go from there then. And I want to talk about, we'll build a case, a story today of why this is so important. But if we go back in time, how did you get into studying linguistics?
Wow, that's a great question. I began my interest in linguistics really because of my father. And my father had a love for language. And I remember when I was really, really, really little and I couldn't sleep, he was the one who said and sang the lullabies to me, and he would light a match. And somehow in my mind, I connected the flame of life, or the flame with language. The two became very connected. And we also moved to Mexico when I was really young, and so I had a very strong sense of second language and other language. So I think that began my interest and love for language, and I landed up at UC Berkeley in the linguistics department. It was a great department there. And to me, language reflects so much about what's going on and how we think and see the world. And it's been my love really my whole life. And my father was a huge part of that process.
You could say he lit your flame.
He lit my flame. Absolutely.
So on that note, what was your dad's definition of spiritual life?
My dad's definition of spiritual life, as you alluded to in that beautiful introduction, my dad used to say he was a gastronomical Jew. So what that meant for him is that his experience of the divine was a corned beef on rye, a coleslaw on the side, and a cream soda. He had no sense of there being anything beyond the material. Now, he loved the material world and enjoyed it, but he really had no sense there was anything beyond this world at all. And, he had no sense. Matter of fact, he used to say his idea of the afterlife were the worms beneath the earth, and that was, going to be his afterlife.
From dust to dust.
From dust to dust.
Until that began to change, didn't it?
Absolutely. And it was in the last 3 weeks of his life that I began to see changes that absolutely blew me away. And it began with him beginning to talk about angels it was about the third week out. He began to point to angels in the corners of the rafters. And I was stunned. And and this happened throughout the last 3 weeks, in addition to other amazing changes in his perceptions and language. And then at the 3 days before he died, he announced, the angels say enough, enough, 3 days left. And indeed, 3 days later, he was gone.
Wow.
Or at least gone on this realm.
And that's something we'll talk about more later, that seems one of the many themes is that 3 days out, that there's kind of an announcement that's made, a proclamation, 3 days to go.
Yeah, yes, that is very true.
So as a linguist where words really matter, this must have really struck you, this change going on.
Yes. his discussion of angels and then other shifts in his language that I saw as in those last 3 weeks when he came home from the hospital and pretty much announced that he was just ready to surrender to whatever was going to happen. I saw several shifts of his language, not just talking about angels, but he started using metaphors in really unique ways. And sort of something like you had mentioned earlier in the intro, there's so much so in sorrow, right? Which is technically nonsense from a linguistic point of view.
Oh, I'm
right?
going to go with Shakespeare, actually.
Yep.
Because it's actually really profound.
Absolutely. And that's what I've come to discover. I saw it in my father's last words, and then when I began this research, I've seen it in so much of the language of the dying, this language that is really many times more like poetry. For example, someone else said, how much wider does this wider go? Right? So you see that kind of language in those final days, often.
So how did you get started? And we'll keep coming back to your dad's experience. How did you get started going down this rabbit hole, and what's the project that you started?
Well, as I watched the changes in my father's language and became really curious, after he passed on, of course I was in grief, but I was also curious about what I saw. So we were in Berkeley at the time, and I went back to my school, Berkeley, and went into the linguistics department and started going through the databases, assuming I was going to find lots of information about the linguistic patterns of end of life, because we know there's lots of material about the beginning of life, right? Language acquisition in children and babies and so forth. So I went in there and I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find anything except a few little references. There's a lot about the communication between healthcare professionals and the dying about end-of-life directives, but not about these patterns. So when I saw there wasn't any information, I just started to read everything I could about end-of-life and near-death experiences and so forth. And that led me to reading Raymond Moody's, or rereading Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, in which he coined the term near-death experience. And I had read the book when I was 17 and was completely in awe of it. So I reread it, and I became very curious. And synchronistically, about a week after that, my mother told me that a friend of hers was teaching with Raymond Moody in Alabama, close to where he was living. And it was about $2,000 for the week-long retreat. And I was a teacher, so that's a lot of money for a teacher. But synchronistically, a few days later, my tax refund came in the mail for something like $19.91 and 52 cents or something. So I thought, okay, I'm taking it as a sign, and just went and met Raymond Moody and learned so much about the near-death experience. But then on the fourth day of the workshop, he started talking about his first interest. He had a PhD in philosophy, and he had a love for unintelligible language. He was intrigued, for example, by the language of Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland, where the language is paradoxical and nonsensical, right? So what happened is he actually came to the idea of the near-death experience after his PhD in philosophy and became a medical student, because he noticed that people who had died and came back from that started speaking in these paradoxical ways, like, I never felt as alive as when I was dead, right? Or it felt like it took 1 minute or an eternity. And they came back with these really, nonsensical phrases.
I have one that I use all the time, particularly with my wife. Language is not my first language.
Absolutely. That's a perfect example. That's a great example. And I love that. So when he started noticing in the language of people who died and then came back to life, these patterns, he started writing down these nonsensical phrases about tunnels in the middle of nowhere, so to speak, right? Or, there is no place, but there is a place. And that's how he came to the near-death experience. And so at this retreat, he started talking about it, and he started talking about his love for language, and I was very excited. And then he said he was really interested in the final words of people and was looking for someone who had some interest in linguistics to maybe do some work with him. And I thought, oh, amazing. And So I decided at that point I was in a position where I could just quit my job. Kids were out of the house basically, and I moved to Georgia with my husband, who synchronistically was born in Georgia. Also synchronistically, we found out grew up in the same neighborhood as Raymond Moody, but that's a whole nother
Wow.
story later. But so we moved to Georgia, and I just took the plunge, and because I really felt, for lack of a better word, obsessed by this curiosity about final words.
I can appreciate it. We'll get to my grandma's final words later on, but I can see where that would come from. And if I understand right, your father at one point, he ended up as his health was starting to go away, he found himself one evening in his underwear on the streets. He gets picked up by the police, and he's talking about taking boxes to a big art show.
Absolutely. Now, first of all, my father, this was something not characteristic of my father, right? PhD in psychology, very lucid. But he walked down, and my mother is an artist, so for his whole life, carrying boxes and going to the big art show was a very important part of his life. But here he was, a few weeks before dying, making this big announcement about an art show that didn't exist. It was midnight. He was strolling down the street. There were no boxes in his hands. And at the time, I just thought, oh, it's the medications, or daddy's going crazy or something. But what I came to find out later is a pronouncement or an announcement of a big occasion or a big event, the big dance, the big ball, the big golf tournament, the big poker game. This kind of an announcement of a big event approaching is actually very, very common in people's final words. And indeed also boxes emerge often in people's final words or in my sample. So yes, that began my curiosity, and also I was perplexed that someone who had always been so lucid had suddenly gone into what seemed another world, right? So yes.
And so true it is. So how many people have you started the Final Words Project, you've been interviewing people. How many people have you interviewed? And then we'll talk about some of the key categories and things like boxes, which is really fascinating.
Yeah. I think I have two types of interviews. I have about 120 people who are loved ones or family members who actually brought me concrete utterances or transcripts, right? Shared accounts through my website. Yeah, I think I'm at about 125 now. But then I have all the interviews with healthcare professionals where I got accounts also, but more overview, right? With the interviews, it was not specific transcripts, but overview. So yeah, so a small sample, and it was not done. I am just a very curious person who has done an informal inquiry. This is not academic research, and yeah.
Which is interesting. There's something more, I don't know, for lack of another term, real to it. There's something very, very tangible to it, as well as interwoven with a lot of emotion. So let's talk about some of these key categories, and maybe we'll start as, what are signature metaphors?
All of us, we all have what I think of as a life narrative and a life story, and the things that are really, really important to us. And I'm going to use my notes because I don't want to be inaccurate when I quote things. For example, dancer and choreographer Jeffrey Holder, his life was about dance, right? So as he was dying, his words were arms 2, 3. His very final words, turn 2, 3, swing 2, 3, down 2, 3. So that's a signature metaphor because it's so closely connected to his life. It may not be something, my husband who teaches martial arts, that may not be his signature metaphor, right? It might be something else. Another one, someone shared with me, he would awaken, speaking about a father, he would awaken and look over at me and smile so big. He was a roofing contractor. And he told me, they have all these kitchen nets over there. There are miles and miles of them. And he would be helping build them. So for him, of course, the metaphor of his life was remodeling in kitchenettes. So when he thought about the other side or was beginning to transition, it was about doing remodeling of the kitchenettes, right? So that's the signature. Just like for my father, the metaphor of carrying the boxes to the big art show was such a part of his life.
And there was a magician Jack, and I don't have the full quote down here, but it's something to the effect of watch my greatest trick in the world, watch me disappear.
Yeah, it was a remarkable story from Doug Smith's book. Yes, absolutely. Really intriguing. A kind of a small town magician who worked kids' birthday parties and so forth. Someone who worked at hospice closely with him. And he would used to do tricks for this hospice worker. And then one day he contacts this guy and says, I have a great trick, my best trick so far. And this gentleman walks in the door and he says, come here, come a little closer, watch me disappear. And moments later, he was gone. So, and this is written in a book by a hospice professional. It's a real story and a remarkable one.
From there, can you share about the importance of threesomes and foursomes, or like we've got a poker game going and we need one more?
Yeah, that was one thing that really surprised me. It sounds like there's a lot of golf going on because people would talk about the dying would talk about people who are already had deceased or had already died, and they would say, oh yeah, John and Jack and Joseph are there, and they need a fourth for the golf game, and they're calling upon me to be the fourth, to make a foursome. I also heard that in stories about poker. And there were several accounts like that. And that's really interesting because it seems to signify some sort of completion. We know the number 4 is often associated with completion. So, yeah, very fascinating that is a recurring kind of association. Yes.
Thank you. And then let's go back to the association of boxes and putting things in order. And I think of them as vessels. And we're leaving one vessel and we're moving to another vessel, a vessel that's wider than wide.
Ah, beautiful. I think that's a great association with that, the great connection. And the other connection is that George Lakoff, who has studied metaphor here at Berkeley, talks about that one of the ways that we in this country talk about the mind is almost like a machine. That is something that can be in order or be in disorder. And the whole idea of things being out of order and order, and a lot of times boxes have to do with putting things in order so that's another thing. But I love the vessel idea. I think that's very right on.
Thank you. If we go and when you were talking about 3s and 4s, you're getting into the Jungian and dream world. You had a dream that your husband told you was a murder of 10 black crows. What can you tell us about that?
Oh, that's really it felt like, that sort of, they call it, I guess, hypnagogia, where you're between waking and sleeping state. And I was having these dreams about these black crows, and it's funny about language, right? So I said to my husband, I saw these crows, and he said, you mean a murder of black crows? And then the next morning, I remember walking, and there were these crows, and I really felt my father's presence with there. And what I was talking about when I discussed that is just how there's this dream time that all of us tap into throughout our lives. And it feels to me that end of life, that dream time is very powerful and prominent. I saw Ram Dass the other day in a webinar, and he sits at bedside with the dying, and he talks about it as soul land. And I thought that was a really beautiful term. But, dream time and soul land are filled with metaphors and images that can be very powerful.
I'm thinking of Ram Dass, the only time I've seen him a few years ago on Maui, and how crystal clear his eyes are, and such an amazing being. And he is so focused with, obviously at this point in his life, the death and dying and what we can learn from that. Yes.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's move forward and talk about travel metaphors, because I think you mentioned a dental hygienist, or grandmother's final words, yellow bus, there's the bus. Who is driving the bus, Grandma? Not sure, but lots of angels.
Exactly. And these travel metaphors are probably the most prevalent. And they've been spoken about. A few other researchers, have seen them and spoken about them also. And my father, who is a gambler, among other things, talked about, all right, get the oxygen tank ready because for our big trip to Las Vegas. People tend to talk again. We were speaking about signature metaphors before. So let's say it's someone who loves boats. They will talk about waiting for the boat, or someone who has a car. One nurse explained to me she had a patient who kept saying, where's my Jetta? Where's my Jetta? And the wife kept saying, honey, it's parked outside. It's parked outside. But it really was a metaphor for getting ready to travel somewhere. Passports come a lot, emerge a lot in the language of last words. So a lot of these metaphors, let's see if I have a couple here. That was one I have here about the angels and the bus. One conversation with a chaplain was, you lost your passport. That sounds very upsetting. Yes. I cannot go where I want to go. Oh, wow, you cannot go. You're stuck. Yes, I'm stuck here between two countries. I'm here, but I want to be there. Oh, you want to be there? Yes, I so long to be there. Yes, you so long to be there. So these kinds of conversations, many hospice workers know, are common at end of life.
What is so fascinating, first off, I hadn't realized I have my passport here. That was not planned. For those who can't see it on audio, I've got my passport here in front of the camera. That doesn't mean I'm planning on crossing over this afternoon, far from it. But what the chaplain did, and it's something that you discuss in the book, is he didn't try to talk about this world and say stuff in our framework of logic, but to repeat back and try to listen and hear and let know I am hearing you to the individual who's crossing over soon.
Absolutely. And that's, my big hope with this book is that people are not afraid of this language and can step into the reality of our loved ones as they're passing on, because none of us really know for certain, what happens when we pass. And I think it's an unbelievable invitation to engage in another reality. And, I know as a linguist that if you were to hear Chinese or a foreign language of any kind, it would sound completely unintelligible. And yet we would never say, oh, Chinese is a bad language. It's all nonsense. It doesn't make sense. We would just know that it's from another territory or another country. And I really feel that way about end-of-life language, and that the more we can try to enter in with our loved ones, the greater support we can be to them. But the other remarkable thing that's happened to me through this work is the more I entered into my father's end-of-life language, the more open I seem to be psychically, and the more I seem to be tuned in to, I don't know if we call it another dimension, if nothing else, to think of it as the field. And it really seems that as we enter in and embrace end-of-life language, we're also embracing something else bigger than that. And that's very compelling to me.
You talk about it in the book, that there's kind of this field around the individual where their consciousness is expanding, and we can grab our board and hop onto that wave and surf it with them.
Absolutely. And, it's difficult because when someone we love is dying, we're grief-stricken and we're scared, and there's a lot going. It's hard. That's a tall order sometimes. And yet, for me, end of life can be something sacred, and at least to hold that language and hold the experience with the same sense of awe that we would experience someone's birth. And it's hard. I mean, it's a hard thing to do, but that's my invitation. And that was what my father taught me through his final words, because I saw that through his language, through the interesting things he was saying, the more I could be in rapport with him and embrace it and invite it, the more both of us seemed to travel to the end, or the end of this life, more easily. And, my father left with tremendous grace and ease, and I was very grateful to be witness to that. Yeah.
It sounds like if we can move past the fear that this language means that they're losing it and something bad has happened, and if we can instead start to embrace this and see this as a positive dance. That's what I would hope people get out of your book, or maybe if we don't call it a dance, a song then. If we can embrace that, then this becomes, nobody says it's going to get easier. It doesn't get easier, but it can be very sacred.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So from there, well, actually, I'm going to jump around in your book a little bit, because we're talking about linguistics. We're talking about this nonsensical language coming up. And since we're diving into the science a little bit here, in a sense, from an evolutionary point of view, it wouldn't make sense that our language would change like this and become almost richer, more colorful, more metaphorical, more poetic at our end of our lives. It wouldn't make any sense at all, would it?
It wouldn't. And also research that we've seen with brain scans and so forth.
Andrew Newberg,
who is, I think, doing terrific work, showed that there are precipitous drops in the same regions of the brain where literal language is stored, or, is engaged, in people who are having deeply spiritual and enlightened experiences, like monks and nuns and so forth. And we also see that in people who are speaking in tongues, who have very mystical experiences. Now, I know as a linguist, that is not a real language. It's really what we call nonsensical syllables. And yet those nonsensical syllables have the power to transport people oftentimes to altered states. So it seems at the very times where we may see drops in certain kinds of language functions and literal language, we often see more transcendental states. So you even think about koans in Buddhism, which is nonsense. What is the sound of one hand clapping? That's sheer nonsense. And yet it seems to tap into what we might think of as nonverbal consciousness. Or what was that great phrase you had again about language?
Language is not my first language.
Language is not my first language. And a lot of mystics would maybe say that really our first language is something nonverbal, right? And people have had near-death experiences that I interviewed, shared with me that it's, Eben Alexander, who wrote the book Proof of Heaven, he explained it as non-linguistic language. What?
Thank you, Eben.
Non-linguistic communication is very much in keeping what you were saying. And people who have near-death experiences explain just what you think is what you hear. There's no hypocrisy on the other side, right? Because what you think is what's communicated. And we also see there was research done by two psychologists working with families where there seems to be telepathic bonds between parents and children. And, parents often say this, like, oh, I know what my child's cries are. I just know. And so that I would almost argue that there might be an essential language that is not language in how we think of it, but is a deep form of communication on either sides of the continuum of the human experience.
Thank you. And we'll probably jump ahead again in a minute. From there, wonder if you can talk briefly about repetition. Sorry. It's fine.
Repetition occurs a lot in the language of the dying, such as oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. And we see it in segments like worlds, so many worlds, so many worlds. One gentleman said, we see it that way. And we also see it in a larger way where someone may start, I call this sustained narratives. They may start speaking about something on December 1st and continue to speak about it, but it evolves. So they might first talk about the train that's having trouble getting on the track on December 1st. December 5th, the train is gaining some momentum. December 7th, there's some problems with the caboose, and then so forth over a period of, as many as 2 or 3 weeks. There's repetition in these themes, but it's a sustained story. So that's another kind of repetition that you see, which is remarkable, because would you be able to remember something you said 3 or 4 weeks ago and then have that unfold and repeat itself over time? So that's another form of repetition I see. And then a sentence that I had mentioned before, like, how much wider does this wider go? Which there were several instances of that is remarkable, to see that kind of language at into play.
I didn't plan to bring this up at all, but I recently, within the last 6 months, I listened to, and I've interviewed him. Actually, we've had Andrew on, and we've had Eben on, and I believe we'll be having Andrew back shortly as my guest. So I'm fascinated about how, like, for instance, the language centers of the brain go quiet, and more of the parts of the brain that light up that have to do with consciousness or a connection, a oneness with those around us.
Yes. Isn't that fascinating? Yes.
So Paul Selig, we've had him on the show, and I was at a talk of his not too long ago, and he was an NYU professor for 27 years in screenwriting, and he discovered he had a gift in channeling, had guides. And eventually he retired because really that took over. But he hung in there for 27 years in more of a analytical field before going, okay, got to go there. His books, he has some of the most brilliant books, and they're written talk by talk. He'll give a talk one day, and the recorder will go, and it won't even be edited except to be, cleaned up for, and then give another talk weeks later, and it will be an exact continuation, which is what you're talking about.
Isn't that fascinating? I have never heard that before, and it makes you think there's like a meta language, right? Something that's bigger, that's how it is. Thank you for that. That is so intriguing. And that's one of the things, too, in researching this book. There's great overlap between the language and the experience of psychic mediums and the language of end of life. Because one of the things I've heard from several psychic mediums is that they'll get these nonsense symbols. Mm-hmm. So William Stillman, who's also has Asperger's and has done a lot of research in autism, has noticed that a lot of the people he researched with autism had ideas and symbols that came to them, and he calls it an iconography. So you might see the image of a rose blooming, but it's not about roses. It's about someone nearby having a heart-opening experience or something. Wow. Or has just fallen in love. And he has found with many of the people that he researched with autism, they may have had trouble verbalizing, but on this nonverbal symbolic level, very rich things and very precognitive imagery was occurring. And for himself, he's a wonderful psychic. And he learned to trust his nonsensical symbols because they were accurate once he learned how to interpret them. And he literally has written down his own spiritual iconography. And what's so fascinating is, with literal speech, for example, you and I would agree that this is a cup, right?
Sure, yeah.
Right? But if this were to occur in my spiritual iconography, if you and I were sitting and I was going to do an intuitive reading for you, what a cup may mean to me may not be what a cup means to you, just like when we were talking about boxes. Right, you had that wonderful association of vessels where I had more association around orderliness, right? But one is not right and one is not wrong. And that's what's different about the language, nonverbal language, or this sort of maybe nonsensical or cross-dimensional language, because there are multiple meanings. Where in this reality, it's one-on-one, cup, that's it.
It's interesting. I was having a coaching session. It was a wild coaching session yesterday, and we were talking about snakes, and all of a sudden a bird hit the side of the house, and it was wild. I've heard of birds hitting windows, but never the side of a house. And I'm like, well, there's a punctuation mark from the universe.
Wow.
What's interesting about it, and I believe this all of this symbolism, because I know there's more to this world than we know in this world. Or there's obviously that's what we're talking about today. So snakes symbolically don't just mean serpents or something dangerous, but a snake often in symbology has a snake wrapping around back to itself, which symbolizes infinity or life continuing. And you talk about circles and circles repeating. And I made that connection. So maybe you can tell us about circles.
Circles appear a lot in final words. And I wish I should have my circle list right in front of me. But there are things, the circles say it's time to complete the cycle was one. Put two circles in half to complete the circles. Yes, they come up a lot. And my first association at the time was shapes come up in very early in the language of children. I mean, apparently we can recognize shapes when we're 6 months old to a year, apparently, or where you have a blueprint. It's wired in us to see shapes. But I also think some of the more kind of archetypal imagery that you're talking about is also real. And it could be that we're archetypal beings. So those symbols that appear in our childhood or in infancy are no less archetypal, right? Just because they are the architecture of our literal world that unfolds. So I love that. Yes. And I think we can make many associations. And what's so powerful also to me about final words is that I spoke with people and people began to transcribe their loved ones' final words. They had their own associations they brought. You know, you might see my father's final words, as I mentioned earlier, and have different associations that I do. But there's almost a power and beauty in that. It's almost like an oracle. Because if you write down your beloved's final words and then, especially afterwards, but you interact with them, they have their own life force that is much like this. You have an interaction, this dance you were talking about, with the symbols, and whether it's the unconscious or the field, however you want to map it, they have their own potency that's very different than this is a cup, you know, and it makes life more magical too for me.
When my grandmother passed away, I wasn't there. My sister had been there only a few days before she passed, and this kind of gets into a topic. We'll go there in a minute, but her last words, or a part of her last conversation, and she'd been in a coma for about a year, and she woke up and spoke with my sister. My sister was a Broadway singer at that point and had been singing to her, and my grandmother said, "What a riot." And to me, having not been there, I heard that on several levels. Certainly she could have been saying this music's a hoot, but I also think she'd been someplace else for the better part of a year, and what a riot.
That's wonderful. I mean, it's a wonderful example. And, you know, one of the things that's common at the end of life we haven't spoken about at all today is people have real visitations. And there's been other research around this just recently. I think it was the year before last, in Buffalo, New York, where they say 70 to 80% of people at end of life describe having visitations from family members and other people who pass on before them to kind of take them home. And when I think about a riot too, I think of a lot of people, you know, in crowded rooms, and what a riot. And I was thinking my dad, about 10 days before he passed, I was in Napa and he was in Berkeley, and I just had the sense of my room being crowded. I woke up in the middle of the night.
3:15 in the morning.
3:15 in the morning. And I don't know, you know that feeling when it just feels like there's other people in the room. And I said to my husband, I have no idea what this means, but something's going on. But he told me, go back to sleep. And then the next day when I went to go visit my father, I asked my mom, how's Dad doing? She said, well, everything's fine. But at 3:15 he woke up and started talking about how crowded the room was, and you know, and he didn't have time to speak with everyone, and that's what Raymond Moody calls a shared death experience, or in the sense I was somehow sharing in this non-local experience. But coming back to your grandmother's words, there's oftentimes a sense that there's this fullness, that there's a lot going on, and in some way I shared that with my father without having any conscious intention of doing it or understanding at the time.
So did you? Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Did you have a visitation by him afterwards?
You know, I did. I've had several, and it began with automatic writing. One morning I heard him say, I have a poem to write for your mother. And I just trusted it, and the poems were beautiful. And I think I've written about 38 over the last few years, and they're all for my mother except for 2. And, you know, again, who knows? If it's my imagination, it's given her great comfort in their beautiful poems. But it felt so real to me, and they feel so real to me.
How much poem writing have you done other than that?
Well, I am a poet. But if someone were to see, the language is very different than my language, which is very intriguing to me also. But I don't know. It's part of the mystery. I don't think I can define it, but I can tell you what my experience is. You know?
What does that feel in the heart when you get such a message?
Amen. It's so comforting, and it's so, so comforting. And, you know, Rumi has a quote about the language of the heart. This is not going to be exactly accurate. It's something like the language of the heart is not made of letters, right? And so, you know, there's a way of trusting the communications we get. And, you know, we know the difference between what feels comforting and feels like truth. We do know that. You know, as I interviewed people often have a sense. And then part of it is in how much comfort and love it gives us. And so the poems that my father brought to me deeply and profoundly comforted me and my mother. So
how many times have you heard, not as a number, but of automatic writing as a tool to be able to reconnect with our loved ones?
I've heard it from a lot of people, and someone locally, Matthew McKay, wrote this beautiful book called Seeking Jordan about connecting with his son who...
We interviewed him as well.
Yeah, he's a terrific human being, and he's local in the Berkeley area. But I've heard it from many people, and now it's becoming more and more prevalent. I don't know if more people are speaking about it or if it's actually more people are doing it. And I think it's wonderful to trust whatever comes through. Why not? Why not?
Woohoo! It's one of the first things we teach all of our coaching clients because they feel it's so important to start to connect either on the inside or outside to something greater than ourselves by diving in right there through the automatic writing.
Amen. Yeah.
So my grandmother, going back there real briefly, and I don't know the whole story, but as it goes, she was in a coma for a year. They decided to pull the plug, remove her feeding tube, and then suddenly a couple days later, with my sister there singing, she came back to life and spoke and said, "What a riot." They went and put the feeding tube back in, didn't go in quite the right place, got an infection, never spoke another word, passed away. To those who have been there, this was, and I can see it, it could be such a traumatic experience, and I wasn't there, so it's not fair of me to say, but stepping back, what I think we saw was what you call a sunset day and terminal lucidity, and that this was a brief, beautiful gift, not a, wow, everything went wrong at the end.
Exactly, and she may have sort of precognitively know that she wasn't going to be here for a long time. I mean, what happens is very often before people die, there's either a moment to several hours of lucidity. And some people even have described that people actually literally have a sense of light or almost glowing around them. But you'll hear people say, you know, be completely unresponsive like your grandmother, and then suddenly say things, "I love you." Or one very dramatic case is a mother told her son where all the financial files were left in the third drawer down. Imagine one was in a coma and came up for just a short period of time. Or as one person got up and said, "It's not what you think," and then went back down and passed away, right? So those moments of lucidity, researchers are just now beginning to look at this more closely. And it doesn't happen with everybody, but it happens frequently, some kind of lucidity before end of life. And oftentimes in those windows of those lucid moments, no one ever says, "Oh, you're such a creep, you're such a bad son." It's never negative. It's always something conciliatory or guiding, or with your grandmother's words, the way I hear it, it's sort of joyous, almost reassuring in a way. So yeah, it's a very remarkable. And I think we're going to see more about it in the years ahead as more research is done.
Cool. Thank you. And there's something, my grandmother was a riot. I don't think she used that term, but her last car, after my grandfather passed away, she's like, "I know this is my last car." And so she got herself, in her 70s or almost 80s, she got herself a Firebird, like Camaro-like car, going, "If I'm going out with a bang." So it makes sense. Her personality came through to say, "What a riot."
Beautiful. And that's kind of what we're talking about with signature metaphors and this signature language. I mean, that's something my father would not have said, right? That would not have been his language, but you knew there was something to your grandmother's essence. And that's the other thing. At end of life, the language really seems to reflect the essence of our personality, during this lifetime.
Beautiful. Let's talk real briefly about consciousness. And we can either go there with Eben Alexander, we can go there. Maybe we go there with Robert Ebert's last words first.
Share those words with us.
It is all a hoax, just an illusion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, when you think about Roger Ebert, he did not characteristically speak that way in his life. So that's what's remarkable about those kinds of words, because he had entered some other awareness, and his wife describes in this article in Esquire that's in my book and also in Esquire magazine 2013, that he started talking about this other place, that heaven was not quite how we think of heaven. It's just a very different, very expansive place. So how fascinating, someone who is not inclined to speak this way, and then their final days had a certain awareness that he did not have before.
What do you think of the big learnings or messages coming back about consciousness that we can learn from people who are, quite literally having one foot on each side of the doorway at this point?
Yeah. Well, for me, the lesson was, anywhere from having visitations from loved ones to seeing angels to moving lucidly and easily between two dimensions, often the sustained narrative, something bigger than us. William James talked about something me-ness, that there's a me that seems bigger than all this external environment. People in comas still have a sense, they describe, of still having some kind of internal dialogue or internal sense of who they are. It really seems that something exists beyond literal reality and language. And I think as we track people's final words, we see that something. I cannot say to you that I know what that is. I know that as someone who loves language and loves life and intrigued by transpersonal experience, that something is going on. And I believe language reveals it. And that's about all I know now. But I do
your
know
cup that you were showing there, your cup is empty so that you can take more in.
Right, because I can't, I feel that the mystery is so big that I don't think I can imagine it yet, if ever. But something is definitely going on when we look at the language of people at end of life.
So to use another nonsensical phrase, this time from Dr. Eben Alexander, from his book, Proof of Heaven, he said when he came back that it was more real than a real. Yes.
Beautiful. That's another great phrase.
So what words of wisdom, having dove into these waters, taken in this breath of knowledge, would you give to parents who are talking maybe to their kids today about maybe a loved one who's passing?
I would say that just trust whatever language that comes, and whenever you can, enter into that reality sacredly. And it's funny that you talked about the example of parents and children, because when we have young children and they start playing make-believe, we know that the best parents enter into that world of make-believe, and that cultivates the seeds for children then to know that what's imaginary is also can become real. If you trust your creative visions and your ideas and people support that, those are the people who oftentimes end up becoming the innovators and the creators, right? But when we step into those realms of make-believe, or what we think of as make-believe, because none of us know really what's real and not, or certainly I can't say that I do. But when we step into those other dimensions or realms or ways of being, great potential comes out of that, right? And it's also, I believe part of the sacred is stepping into the mystery. And by stepping into the mystery, when you talked about the bird that flew in to the house, if you listen to these things, we learn from them, and so, I really encourage of course, we're going to be grief-stricken when someone we love is passing. But as much as we can open our hearts and realize that hearing is also healing, that we can engage in conversations that may be different than the ones we had before the person was dying, but it doesn't mean that they have to be any less than the conversations we've had earlier. Matter of fact, they can be much more and can allow us to connect with something sacred. Because I say in the book, not only are we guides, we're both tourists and guides as we're with those we love as they're dying, because we've never been to that territory as far as we know, at least not in this body. And so we're acting both as tourists and guides, and it's somehow to keep that sense of wonder and awe. Amazing doors can open. I mean, they certainly did for me, and I'm very, very grateful for that.
Thank you. Thank you. What would you tell people to help them with their loved ones when they're there for them? What can they do to listen or speak back as their loved ones are sharing this with them?
I can validate people's experience. If someone says, the yellow bus is coming, you go, oh, wow, tell me about the yellow bus. You sound so excited, Grandma. I would love to hear more. As much as we can, validate people's experience. And the simple technique, of course, is mirroring what people say. And I think that's really, validate, be present, be loving, and expect to find jewels. I think so many people, when people are dying, we expect it's a bad thing. And of course, it's terrible to lose someone we love. But there are many jewels hidden in those final words.
Woohoo! So a few quick wrap-up questions, then we'll jump into a real brief meditation. First off, what personally brings you the greatest happiness, or what I call the woohoo factor?
Oh, wow. I love to dance. And when I have that feeling of feeling spirit in motion, and because I feel my body and my spirit aligned in joy, and I especially love to do that with my husband, who's someone I love deeply, I think that gives me a big woohoo. And another big woohoo is sitting here in conversation with you and sharing work that's deep to my heart. And that's a big woohoo to me, truly. Truly.
As it should be. So what do you hope that people get out of this beautiful book? Actually, first, where can people go to find it and find out more?
You can get this book at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, New World Library, the publisher. And you can also come to www.finalwordsproject.org, which is the website, and get lots of information there as well. And at many of your local bookstores, especially Barnes & Noble, I think, is carrying it.
Beautiful. If you didn't catch that, come on over to InspireNationShow.com and we'll get you over to you as well. So what do you hope that people get out of your book?
I think I would love people to get a sense of how wide language is, right? That language has many faces and dimensions, and not to be afraid of what kind of language you may hear that is outside of the mainstream narrative. And also there's kind of an alchemy and magic to language. And we really see that in End of Life. And we also see it in mystical experience. But in End of Life, the great gift of that language is it's alchemical language. I mean, it's to me there's something very magical about it. And I really hope that people bring a sense of sacred hearing and sacred conversation and engagement at End of Life, and that they can feel comfort and reassurance in knowing that there really might be something beyond this plane. And if nothing else, by engaging in people's final words, everyone can gain more comfort and connection and compassion. So those are the things I hope people get from my book.
Then would you mind leading us in a very short guided meditation?
As you sit in your chair or on the floor, wherever you're seated, and you feel your body resting against the chair, realize that all the language that has ever been spoken and all the language that will be spoken is deeply inside you. That is the language that is unspoken, as well as the words that are said. And realize that everything that comes to us and from us is a gift from the great divine, and there's nothing to fear in any of it. A matter of fact, with every breath that you take, bringing in inspiration and exhaling inspiration are the words that come from the deepest well of experience and knowledge, and it's always there for you. Feel into the language of the heart, and as you feel into the language of the heart, you will feel the words that are most deeply meaningful to those who sit beside you at every phase in your life, and trust them and trust their goodness. Yeah.
Woohoo! Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. This has been so beautiful.
Back at you.
I love your work. When the book came in, we have so many books that come in, as I was mentioning off air. I hadn't read it. I hadn't read the cover. I hadn't read anything. I was just like, oh, like candy. Gimme. The words in here are so important, and it sounds strange, but they're so much fun to read because this is a portal.
Amen. Amen. And this is something I would have never thought. I mean, I never thought that I would have a conversation with someone about final words or death and dying with a sense of lightness in my heart. And again, I don't want to take away from people's suffering because that's very real.
Oh, yeah.
But there really is a sense through this language that there is a portal and something is much bigger than what we think of as our ordinary lives. Yeah, absolutely. It's such a gift for someone who, for myself, that you've read my book so closely and so deeply that you can even quote things for me that I...
I'm sorry.
No, it's a gift. And I really, 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 really appreciate it. I just want to say thank you so deeply for that kind of careful listening.
I love to bring my presence to it. You took the time to put your heart, your soul, your everything in this book. It is the least that I can do to help share this book with the world, to do the same right back for you.
You know, thank you. And as you're speaking, I'm realizing that is another piece of what we can give people at end of life, because everyone who's at the threshold has given everything to their lives, just like I've given 5 years to this book. And the same depth of presence and engagement that you've given to me in this conversation, if we can bring that to every person we love at their final days, it brings joy to everyone.
I gotta go there again. That is a mighty. Woohoo! Well, thank you so much, Lisa. This has been beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you so much.
For everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get words at the threshold, and when the time comes, listen deep and shine bright. Woohoo! Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Really. Thank you. I can speak sort of.
Absolutely.
I mean, this was the deepest interview I've had so far. Wow. You're not afraid to go there, and you're so bright. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like below. Also, leave your comments. Have some real fun with it. Subscribe to our channel where you're going to get more great videos, more interviews coming up. And check out our website, inspirenationshow.com. That's where you'll find tips, blogs, information, videos you won't find anywhere else, and useful and helpful resources to really help you kickstart your life and to shine bright. Thanks so much again. Thank you for your support. Like, comment, subscribe. See the website. Thanks so much and have fun. Of course, shine bright. Woohoo!